The commander of the U.S. Third Fleet, Vice Admiral William Bull Halsey, did not want another lengthy campaign similar to the one he had gone through in an attempt to capture Munda in New Georgia. I was afraid of another slugging match because of the excessive duration of the Munda operation and our losses, but I didn't know how to avoid it, he said. Therefore, instead of attacking every island that was under Japanese occupation, he chose to avoid them and let them wither on the vine while advancing to seize more vital islands. However, the lesson was not easy to learn. The successful Japanese wave of 1941-1942 has been attributed to early Allied wins in the Pacific War, starting in May 1942. First, the United States' strategic victory. In order to defend northern Australia across the Arafura Sea, the Navy's carrier air forces repelled the Imperial Japanese Navy's, IJN, amphibious assaults against Port Moresby on the southern coast of New Guinea during the Battle of the Coral Sea in the first week of May 1942. The United States came in second. Future IJN operations on the scaled during the first 6 months of the war were severely hampered by the Navy's sinking of Admiral Chuichi, Nagumo's 4 aircraft carriers at Midway in early June 1942. Third, any planned Japanese southeastward expansion into the South Pacific, which was meant to cut off the sea lanes to the Antipodes, was thwarted by the Americans' epic, exhausting conquest of Guadalcanal in the southern Solomon Islands by land, sea, and air forces from August 7, 1942 through February 7, 1943. Fourth, separate Japanese overland and amphibious attempts to capture Port Moresby were thwarted by the first defense of Australian armed forces in New Guinea along the Kokoda Trail and at Milne Bay in August and September 1942. In order to seize the deeply entrenched and fiercely defended Japanese garrisons at Buna and Gona, General Douglas A. MacArthur led a combined Australian-American attack from November 1942 to January 1943 across the treacherous northern Papuan jungle and coast. However, the heartbreaking string of losses the Japanese endured while attempting to defend the New Georgia group of islands in the Middle Solomons has been overlooked. Given the need for imperial forces in other parts of the Central Pacific, New Guinea, and the Asian mainland, the losses sustained on those jungle hellholes were never replaced in terms of the number of Imperial Japanese Army, IJA units, naval ships, planes, and crews. In the Bismarck Archipelago, the seizure of Japanese airdromes on these central Solomon Islands also brought the nascent Allied air campaign nearer to Rabaul on New Britain. The more than 500-mile-long Solomon chain is made up of 6 large islands and numerous smaller ones. At 130 miles long and 30 miles wide, Bougainville is the largest island in the chain and one of the most northern, located 300 miles north of Guadalcanal. The 11 major islands of the Central Solomons were located north of Guadalcanal, with New Georgia being the largest at 45 by 35 miles. At Munda Point on the southwest corner of New Georgia, the Japanese had established a significant airport and base. Munda Point, located roughly 170 miles northwest of Tulagi and Guadalcanal, is the Central Solomon Group's approximate center. Kolombangara, Arundel, Vella Lavella, Gizo, Ganonga, Tetipari, Gatukai, Vangunu, and Rendova are some of the other islands in this group. Across the Blanche Channel, some 7 miles south of New Georgia, is Rendova. Halsey's strategic plans for his advance after securing the Russell Islands after the Guadalcanal victory heavily relied on Rendova's closeness to Munda Point. The logical first steps for Halsey's South Pacific Forces' assault toward the Central Solomons were the Russell Islands, which are located about 125 miles southeast of New Georgia. New Georgia's topography is similar to that of the islands in the Central Solomons, with volcanic cores covered in dense rainforests. There are numerous inlets, lagoons, and channels throughout the island's rocky shoreline. There are rough, jungle-covered cliffs just inland from the coast. There aren't many beaches that are ideal for landing. In order to construct appropriate airfields to support the assault on Guadalcanal, the Japanese conducted a reconnoiter of New Georgia in October 1942. American scout planes found the Japanese working on a well-hidden airport at Munda Point as early as December 1942. Late November saw the arrival of construction teams, several IJA detachments, and members of the Sasebo 6th Special Naval Landing Force, SNLF. Across the Kula Gulf from northwest New Georgia, American pilots also noticed that work was underway on another Japanese airstrip at Vella on Kolombangara. The United States won the Guadalcanal campaign by the first week of February 1943. Marines, Army, and Navy, following over 6 months of gruesome aircraft assaults, naval surface operations, and jungle fighting. The evacuation of Guadalcanal, however, was only viewed by the Japanese as a short-term defeat in the South Pacific. The Emperor and his generals said that Japanese troops were just shifting their focus. They had been on the defense in Papua New Guinea and on the attack on Guadalcanal for a number of months. A reversal was imminent. The acquisition of all of New Guinea, together with a renewed push for Port Moresby from Lae in northeastern New Guinea, was the IJA's top priority following its expulsion from Buna and Gona. Under the continuous command of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the Japanese Combined Fleet Commander, the Solomons and the South Pacific were to be an IJN problem. The Japanese Armed Forces' lack of coordination and effort had a significant negative impact on later campaigns, which didn't resemble the spectacular run of wins from December 1941 to May 1942. Following the defeats at Coral Sea, Midway, Papua, and Guadalcanal, Yamamoto sought to recapture the strategic initiative and secure one more significant victory. The Allies might be forced to negotiate a peace, and the Japanese could retain their new Pacific Empire if they won a landslide victory in 1943. In the first week of February 1943, Yamamoto sketched a new defensive line in the South Pacific that ran north to south through the center of the Solomons, just after the Japanese had evacuated Guadalcanal in Operation K. In the Central Solomons, he had moved his advanced IJN bases to recently built airfields and installations on New Georgia, Kolombangara, and Vella Lavella. Imperial authorities in Tokyo planned to bolster the region in order to retake the initiative after Guadalcanal was abandoned, with the latter delivering supplies and ground reinforcements to the garrisons, particularly on New Georgia with its airport at Munda Point. The IJA and IJN would need to collaborate once more. While Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura, the commander of the 8th Area Army on Rabaul, oversaw the ground forces in the Central Solomons, Yamamoto was in charge of continuing operations in the Solomons. The 17th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Harukichi ex Seikichi Hyakutake, was one of the IJA forces in the Solomons. The Japanese continued to have a clear advantage in the Solomons after losing on Guadalcanal. Compared to American fighter planes, their fighters, the IJN Mitsubishi A6M Ryzen, also known as Zero, and the IJA Nakajima Ki 43 Hayabusa, also known as Oscar, had larger ranges, almost 2,000 miles. Furthermore, Japanese aviation raids from Rabaul were to use the Central Solomon airfields of Munda, Vella, and Bairoko on Vella Lavella as staging grounds for attacks on the American bases at Tulagi and Guadalcanal. In order to preserve the dwindling number of experienced pilots, many of whom had been killed in air battle elsewhere, Japanese aircraft refueled and had emergency landing sites at these Central Solomon airfields. American aircraft stationed on Guadalcanal lacked the range necessary to travel to Rabaul, engage the enemy in aerial battle, and then return to their bases in the late winter of 1943. Yamamoto planned to use his airdromes on Rabaul to redouble his airstrikes on Guadalcanal after realizing this logistical advantage. The Japanese admiral had forced the IJA to originally supply some 1,000 defensive garrison troops for the Central Solomon airfields, including the complex at Munda Point on New Georgia, after Yamamoto had constructed them. Ironically, on April 18, 1943, U.S. Army Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighters based on Guadalcanal shot down Yamamoto's personal IJN Mitsubishi GG-3 Betty bomber while he was on a morale-boosting mission to the northern Solomons. Following Yamamoto's passing, Admiral Minechi Koga assumed command of the combined fleet. Unaware of which would be Halsey's first target in the United States, the Japanese added more IJA and SNLF troops to New Georgia and Kolombangara between February and May 1943. Navy's main campaign in Solomons. Early in May 1943, General Hitoshi Imamura, the commander of the 8th Area Army on Rabaul, appointed Major General Minoru Sasaki as the commanding general of the Southeast Area Detachment, which would be supervised by the IJA's 17th Army and the IJN's 8th Fleet stationed in Rabaul. Sasaki was tasked with leading the defense of New Georgia and Kolombangara. Sasaki served in combat for 3 years, specializing in mechanized warfare. He was assigned to lead the 38th Infantry Group, which was based in Vella and included elements of the IJA 6th and 38th Divisions. The Japanese garrison on New Georgia had about 8,000 soldiers by the end of May 1943. There would be 5,500 SNLF and 5,000 IJA troops on New Georgia at the time of Halsey's assault in July. An additional 4,200 men would be available on Santa Isabel Island, which is located northeast of New Georgia and directly north of the Russell Islands. The Japanese High Command knew that Allied fighters would have little trouble attacking Kolombangara and New Georgia Island once the Americans had taken Guadalcanal and the Russell Islands. Additionally, the U.S. marauded the Munda Airfield, fire from Navy destroyers as early as March 1943. In order to prepare for the main invasion of New Georgia, Halsey's strategists intended for Rendova, which is located south of Munda Point, to be taken. Rendova was also to be used as a great artillery platform for shelling Munda Airfield, with 155mm long Tom M2 cannons and 105mm howitzers. The heavily fortified U.S. 43rd Infantry Division, which had been moved from Guadalcanal and the Russell Islands, was first used in Halsey's Central Solomons offensive to gain tactical positions at 4 locations in the immediate area for the eventual invasion of New Georgia and the seizure of Munda Airfield. Marine Brig General DeWitt Peck, Halsey's War Plans commander, created the first plan for the invasion of New Georgia. Nevertheless, Allied plans for offensives in the South Pacific were continuously modified. A division-strength contingent was supposed to land at Segi Point on the southeast tip of New Georgia, according to Peck's initial plans. After that, Halsey's ground forces would march westward to seize Munda Airfield. Other officers seriously questioned the viability of the march to attack Munda through the southern coastal jungle of New Georgia, which was littered with Japanese outposts, as well as the amphibious landing point at Segi Point. The Japanese troops on New Georgia had conjectured that the Americans would try a quicker overland attack on Munda Airport after landing at Dragon Peninsula on the southwest coast. Only tiny landing zones with dense, untracked vegetation were present at the majority of other coastal locations. In order to rapidly strengthen a defense in depth around Munda, Sasaki believed that a landing along the Dragon Peninsula would allow him to receive significant reinforcements from southern Bougainville and Vella on Kolombangara. Marine Lieutenant William P. Coltis, an intelligence officer on Halsey's staff, and 6 other Marines conducted an initial assessment of the island, while the tense American attack preparations for New Georgia were still underway. On March 3, 1943, this contingent touched down at Segi Point. They stayed at Donald Kennedy's armed compound, which had an arsenal and a prisoner of war cage at the former Markham plantation, and met the colorful president there. Kennedy was a British district officer who was initially assigned to Santa Isabel Island and oversaw the Western Islands. Kennedy fled to Segi Point, which was more centrally located and had sheltered approaches with isolated coastal waterways, when the Japanese arrived on New Georgia. He developed into a crucial component of the Australian coast-watching network at Segi Point, where he specialized in communications and radio maintenance. Kennedy also oversaw an armed native constabulary in the area that saved downed Allied pilots during aerial combat. In addition to studying Kennedy's plans at his coast-watching headquarters, Coltis and his fellow leathernecks spent 3 weeks reconnoitering the area behind enemy lines where the Americans were about to invade. Speaking pidgin with Kennedy's native scouts, Coltis, who had prior experience in the Solomon Islands, helped him with reconnaissance and avoiding Japanese patrols. Coltis also met another coast watcher at Segi Point, Lieutenant A.R. Evans of the Royal Australian Navy Volunteer Reserve, RANVR, a pre-war purser on a steamer in the Solomons who would be instrumental in the rescue of future U.S. President Lieutenant J.G. John F. Kennedy and his crew following the Japanese destroyer Amagiriai's ramming and sinking of their PT-1009 in the Blackett Strait on August 2, 1943. JFK's motor torpedo ship was trying to stop the Tokyo Express, an enemy destroyer from Rabaul, from delivering reinforcements to the Vella and Munda airfields on Kolombangara and New Georgia. Evans was scheduled to leave for Kolombangara in early March 1943 to see the Japanese build an airport at Vella to support the enemy airdrome at Munda Point. Kudas informed Halsey's headquarters in Noumea, New Caledonia, that a full-scale attack on New Georgia was still feasible, but not via Segi Point, after completing his reconnoitering. At the same time as Kultas's mission, 4 further Marine patrols in the central Solomon region, assisted by other Coastwatchers, investigated the Roviana Lagoon on the eastern bank of the Dragon Peninsula and determined that Zanana and Liana beaches would be good places for amphibious landings. It was evident from the reports of these Marine scouting trips that Halsey's attack on New Georgia may occur in locations considerably closer to Munda than previously believed. In order to prepare for a significant amphibious operation at Zanana Beach via the Roviana Lagoon, Halsey's strategists now called for the deployment of distinct forces at many locations. Rendova was to be converted into a PT boat and forward artillery post, with its harbor and barrier islets in order to shell Munda and obstruct the IJN's seaborne supply runs. The eventual seizure of Munda Airfield was thought to need the occupation of 3 more sites. These included Wickham Anchorage, a strategically located, protected Japanese-occupied harbor off the eastern coast of Vangunu Island, east of Seiji Point; Viru Harbor, a Japanese base up the southern coast of New Georgia, west of Seiji Point; and Segi Point, Brig, Gengerpeck's original main landing position on the southeast end of New Georgia, close to Donald Kennedy's compound. Fearing an impending Japanese attack, the whole 1st Battalion, 229th IJA Infantry Regiment, prepared for the American arrival at Segi Point. After taking control of Kennedy's defended camp, the Japanese planned to establish their own airport at Segi Point, but Halsey's organizers wanted the United States to construct a fighter strip there. CBs are Navy construction battalions. The distance Halsey's aircraft had to travel on sorties to the Central Solomons from their existing airfields on Guadalcanal, and from recently built ones in the Russell Islands, would be reduced with an airstrip at Segi Point. As part of Halsey's Eastern Landing Force, half of the 4th Marine Raider battalions, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Michael Curran, landed at Segi Point on June 20th, 1943. The newly created March 1943 1st Marine Raider Regiment, consisting of the 1st and 4th Battalions, was led by Colonel Harry B. Liversedge, who had previously supervised the stateside training of Marine Raider battalions in September 1942. On June 22nd, soldiers from the 43rd Division's 1st Battalion, 103rd Infantry Regiment, and an airport survey group also arrived at Segi Point to support the Marines. The goal of the Eastern Landing Force was to prevent Japanese intrusion from either Viru Harbor or Wickham Anchorage into Kennedy's base and the surrounding area for the proposed American airstrip. On June 30th, 1943, the 4th Marine Raider Battalion Detachment went west through heavy rain and thick mud to attack Japanese fortifications at Viru Harbor from the rear, because there was no significant engagement at Segi Point. The Marine Raiders took control of the enemy complex, a landing barge facility, and a shore battery at Viru, following a few firefights and a failed Japanese banzai charge by 250 members of the IJA 229th Infantry Regiment. Following the discovery of enemy snipers in the nearby bush, and the evacuation of the remaining Japanese to Munda via jungle routes to the west, the Marines handed the area over to Army forces. By July 1st, Halsey's further moves through Blanche Channel toward the Dragon Peninsula and Rendova were no longer hampered by the Japanese position at Viru Harbor. On June 30th, 1943, another unit of Halsey's Eastern Landing Force took control of Wickham Anchorage. Halsey intended it to serve as a refueling station for PT boats and other small ships traveling north from Guadalcanal because of its location east of Segi Point, between the Vangunu and Gatakai Islands. At the north point of the island, Halsey's Western Landing Force attacked Rendova on June 30th amid heavy tropical rain. In order to maintain Blanche Channel's entrance to Rendova Harbor open, elements of the 43rd Division's 169th Infantry Regiment also captured Bao and Kokorana, two smaller barrier islands. After landing at Rendova, a battalion of the 103rd Infantry Regiment and 3,500 members of the 172nd Regimental Combat Team, RCT, of the 43rd Infantry Division engaged in a series of firefights with no more than 400 Japanese. The 2nd Company of the 6th Kure SNLF and the 3rd Battalion, 229th Infantry Regiment, were in company strength with the Japanese soldiers. Some Japanese artillery batteries on Munda Point were silenced by U.S. Navy destroyers that accompanied the transports. The bulk of the Japanese naval guns at Munda were not positioned correctly to fire on the assault beaches, which was fortunate for the Americans landing on Rendova. Furthermore, the Western Landing Force's amphibious assault could not be harassed by the Japanese mountain artillery at Munda due to their limited range. On Rendova, some of the enemy fled to Munda. On July 1st, the Marine 9th Defense Battalion set up anti-aircraft emplacements with their 90mm, 40mm Bofors, 20mm, and 50 caliber guns around the Rendova plantation, while the 172nd RCT troops pushed inland from the beachhead. That morning, the expected Japanese aerial counterattack took place, albeit with just Rabaul 0 fighters. Without losing a ship, the invading fleet was protected by Allied combatants who were sent from Guadalcanal. Admiral Turner's command transport, the USS M. Cawley, was disabled by another Japanese air raid in the late afternoon that involved both fighters and torpedo bombers. The ship was eventually unintentionally lost that evening, most likely by torpedoes from an American PT boat. Over the course of the following few days, Japanese airstrikes destroyed multiple landing boats and killed 150 Americans at the Rendova beachhead. The Rendova landings were a perfect success, but Japanese cruisers and destroyers also harassed the beachhead at night by passing through the Slot, the canal that runs between Solomon's Islands. Although the Marines and infantry on Rendova had to deal with the constant rain, persistent mud, and several treetop-level Japanese airstrikes, long-range artillery was ready to bomb Munda Airstrip. Secured July 4th, 1943, was Rendova. In order to launch the direct invasion of New Georgia, with a large force at a location nearer Munda Airfield than initially planned, Halsey's staff expected that after 4 days on Rendova, enough men and equipment would be concentrated for an assault across Roviana Lagoon to Zanana Beach on the southeast side of the Dragon Peninsula on July 4th, 5. General Sasaki witnessed the victorious American landings at Rendova while he was at Munda. Because he thought the Americans would land at Lamberti Plantation, or Munda Point itself, the Japanese commander did not immediately oppose Halsey's Rendova raid. On June 30th, 1943, however, Sasaki saw firsthand 2 companies of the U.S. 169th Infantry Regiment capturing 2 islets, Baraulu and Sasavel, on either side of Onia Visi entrance, the waterway that connects Roviana Lagoon and Zanana Beach to Blanche Channel. Sasaki came to the conclusion that Halsey planned to land on New Georgia with force near Zanana Beach. About 200 of Sasaki's outlying garrisons in eastern New Georgia were available to defend the airfield in mid-July to early August, but he ordered them to retreat interior toward Munda upon spotting the Americans on these islets. Halsey had positioned the U.S. as commander of the New Georgia Occupation Force, NGOF, Army Major. General John H. Hester led the 43rd Infantry Division, a New England National Guard unit. After leaving Rendova for Zanana Beach, Hester's objective was to march west and take control of Munda Airfield. Always, from July 3rd to 5, Hester started transporting troops from Rendova to Zanana Beach in landing boats or coastal transport vessels, which were refurbished World War I destroyers known as Assault Purpose Destroyers, APDs. Major elements of the 169th and 172nd Infantry Regiments of the 43rd Infantry Division, a battalion of Army Field Artillery, 2 Navy Seabee battalions, a small detachment of the 1st Fiji Division, members of the 9th Marine Defense Battalion, and other Fleet Marine Force units comprised his landing force. Colonel Liversedge led 2,600 soldiers from the 1st Marine Raider Battalion and 1st Marine Raider Regiment, as well as the 3rd Battalion from each of the 37th Division's 145th and 148th Infantry Regiments, to occupy Rice Anchorage on the far western coast of New Georgia, along Kula Gulf, across from Kolombangara, in order to help isolate Munda Airfield. Although the 1st and 4th Raider Battalions initially made up the 1st Marine Raider Regiment, half of the 4th Raider Battalion was stationed at Wickham Anchorage on the southeast coast of Vangunu Island, and the other half was at Segi Point and Viru Harbor on the south coast of New Georgia. The Northern Landing Force was the name given to Liversedge's formation. Northeast of the Japanese defenses at Bairoko Harbor and Enogai Inlet was a marshy river delta known as Rice Anchorage. Approach paths from Rice Anchorage to Enogai Inlet were cut through the jungle with the help of Coastwatcher guides and native scouts. Enogai's 140mm artillery firing of the Marines and soldiers after they arrived unopposed dispersed their naval landing force, leaving the Americans stranded and without supplies until Enogai could be captured. The purpose of Enogai's seizure and the planned attack on Bairoko that followed was to stop the Japanese from using Bairoko Harbor to reinforce the Munda region from Vella on Kolombangara. From Rice Anchorage, Liversedge's army began an 8-mile overland march, which turned into a drawn-out 3-day nightmare as the Americans had to cross 2 high-flowing rivers and flooded jungle swamps due to the intense rains. While the 2 inexperienced Ohio National Guard battalions of the 37th Division were to guard the inland roads and communication channels in the area, the Marines of the 1st Raider Battalion were to directly attack the Japanese position at Enogai on the western side of Enogai Inlet. A garrison of 800 6th Curie SNLF soldiers guarded the Japanese barge base at Enogai. Marine patrols had collected the comprehensive blueprints for Enogai's defense from Japanese soldiers who had died, and the enemy base also included a battery of 4 140mm rifle naval guns, positioned to command Kula Gulf. The Japanese defenses at Enogai fell on July 10th after 5 days of intermittent jungle fighting between company-sized forces. The remaining enemy members either escaped to Bairoko or tried to swim to small islands offshore in Kula Gulf while being fired at by Marines from the shore. Liversedge radioed for PBY Catalina flying boats to be sent to rescue the injured, leaving a casualty tally of 48 dead Marine Raiders and about 100 more casualties from the encounter. At Enogai, the dead Marines were laid to rest in a makeshift little cemetery. The Army units of the 3rd Battalion, 145th Regiment, which was occupying a blocking position on the Bairoko to Munda path, which was set up to prevent Japanese reinforcements from the airfield, also faced problems with reinforcement and resupply. The 750 men in the battalion had been cut in half due to disease, a shortage of food, and almost constant jungle fighting. After a while, Liversedge was forced to leave the trail block and sent the remaining soldiers back to Triri, which was further inland, to rest and get ready for the impending Bairoko attack. Litor Cole. Michael S. Curran's redeployed 4th Raider Battalion, which had landed at Enogai on July 18th, provided reinforcements to the 1st Raider Battalion. On July the 20th, the remaining elements of both Marine Raider battalions proceeded to the primary enemy position at Bairoko Harbor and launched an attack from the north. Using an inland track that led to Bairoko, the Army divisions were to launch a converging attack from Triri to the east. There were still smaller Army units to guard the bases at Triri and Rice Anchorage. Marine 60mm mortars were unable to penetrate the deeply entrenched enemy positions at Bairoko, because the Japanese fortifications were reinforced with a battalion-sized garrison equipped with pack artillery and 90mm mortars. On inland paths, the Army units did not make much progress against enemy fortifications that were already planned. The Raiders and Army soldiers thereafter suffered greatly, with the former suffering a 20% loss rate due to a lack of air support and precise artillery fire to destroy the Japanese bunkers. Liversedge was right to worry that during the evening of July 21st, Vella would provide a significant reinforcement to the enemy position at Bairoko. Ultimately, Liversedge had to withdraw the northern landing force to Inogai due to ongoing Japanese heavy mortar fire. Request all available planes, strike both sides Bairoko Harbor, beginning Oro 900. Liversedge radioed his superiors early on July 22nd. You are paying for our withdrawal. At Bairoko Harbor, the Marines suffered one of their few losses in the South Pacific. Since Inogai was still under the control of the northern landing force, the Japanese had managed to hold on to their barge base. The Northern Landing Force's mission to Bairoko, which placed Green Army infantry battalions against an experienced enemy in horrifying jungle environment, was in fact a disaster. When forced to travel in single line under the darkness of the jungle canopy and cross neck-deep streams, traditional U.S. Army infantry tactics that had been taught at the war colleges crumbled. Requested airstrikes to destroy Japanese machine gun positions that were immune to light infantry weapons and almost constant mortar barrages did not come to fruition, in contrast to other infantry battle locations. Unfortunately, the exhausting march of these American forces was remarkably similar to that of other inexperienced U.S. Army battalions that fought the Japanese in late 1942 at Buna in northern Papua. General Hester's 169th and 122nd Infantry Regiments made separate pushes toward the Bairoko River, moving slowly out of the Zanana Beach head and down the eastern coast of the Dragon Peninsula in New Georgia. The Japanese observed that the 43rd Division's approach was laborious and time-consuming due to the weather and American tactical prudence. The two regiments eventually arrived to the Bairoko River on July 7th. Along with the 229th Infantry Regiment and elements of the 230th Infantry Regiment, which had fought on Guadalcanal, General Sasaki deployed the more than 3,500 additional 13th Infantry Regiment reinforcements that he had received from Kolombangara via Bairoko in preparation for future counterattacks against the Zanana Beachhead. During the evening of July 7th, Sasaki had placed units of the 13th Infantry Regiment between the American 169th and 172nd Regiments on the southern part of the Dragon Peninsula. The 169th Regiment's front battalions were hit by the Japanese, and during the 6 hours of uncontrolled firing and grenade tossing, some American infantry companies practically collapsed. The U.S. infantry regiments waited 2 more days to get ready to advance across the Bairoko River toward Munda to the southwest, following the enemy attack the night before. Hester signaled his infantry's approach with a huge artillery fire in the early hours of July 9th. Additionally, a task team consisting of 4 U.S. soldiers pounded the Japanese defenses west of the Bairoko River with about 2,000 rounds of 5-inch high explosive HE shells, Navy destroyers. Amid the waning naval fire, 5 U.S. battalions of Army artillery opened. Although the Japanese positions suffered only minor damage, the intense bombardment lifted the spirits of the American infantrymen. The location and level of fortification of enemy sites were not well known to American intelligence officers. Although the 2 Army units moved on time, their movements were not forceful, which allowed the Japanese to keep close to them while reducing their vulnerability to American artillery fire. 5 days after the landings at Zanana Beach, on July the 10th, Hester's staff came to the conclusion that Sasaki's forces were firmly established in emplacements made of coconut logs and camouflaged coral along the numerous hills that led to Munda. One by one, the NGOF would have to remove these barriers, frequently discovering that those in the vicinity were providing mutual assistance with a large number of shielded light and heavy machine guns that were screened by adjacent men in rifle pits. Many battalions of the U.S. 169th Infantry Regiment were really stopped in their tracks by Japanese mortars and light artillery pieces that were strategically positioned behind these defensive lines to wreak havoc on advancing American columns. Hester dismissed the colonel, in charge of this regiment, and the majority of his staff, replacing them with younger, more active officers. Since his 169th Infantry Regiment had fallen well behind the 172nd's offensive on its left flank, Hester concluded that he might cut his supply lines and help his advance significantly if he established a second beachhead at Liana southwest of Zanana. Actually, Japanese invading forces were able to harry the American supply lines and rear areas because the 169th and 172nd Regiments were frequently separated. The 172nd Infantry Regiment arrived at the Liana region by the evening of July 13th, but due to the terrain, heat, and fatigue, they were forced to only set up defensive positions for the night. The 3rd Battalion, 103rd Infantry Regiment of the 43rd Division, arrived in Liana the following day. Additionally, 6 Marine M3 light tanks landed on July 15th, and tank lighters were ready to dismount from them offshore. Sasaki launched his daring counterattack against the American landing spots on July 17th. As in previous Guadalcanal battles, the enemy counterattack was significantly hindered by the dense jungle, limited Japanese inter-unit communication, and American defensive tactics. However, late on July the 17th, the U.S. 43rd Division, which was positioned on the Bairoko River, had its right flank turned by significant forces of the 13th Japanese Infantry Regiment, commanded by Colonel Satoshi Tomonari, who were marching from north of Munda. In order to cut off connection with the 172nd Infantry Regiment to the southwest, the Japanese attacked the beachhead supply station at Zanana and made it to the American command post there. The Japanese troops were unable to organize into their traditional banzai charge due to American artillery bombardment from the offshore islands of Roviana and Sasavele in Roviana Lagoon. The Japanese were unable to take control of the Zanana beachhead because to a strong defense by Marine and 172nd Infantry Regiment heavy weapons platoons, as well as roughly 50 Army service, non-combatant soldiers, and artillerymen. By daybreak, Tomonari was compelled to abandon his assault and give the order for the remaining soldiers in the regiment to evacuate to Munda. Sasaki's final attempt to strike the American defenses was the Japanese counterattack on July 17th. New troops were required following the valiant beachhead defense. Major General Robert S. Beitler relieved the 172nd Infantry Regiment on the battlefield by bringing his 145th and 148th Infantry Regiments from Rendova without their 3rd Battalions that had landed at Rice Anchorage as part of the Northern Landing Force. Between July 18th and 22, the 103rd and 161st Infantry Regiments from the 43rd and 25th Divisions, respectively, took the position of the 169th Infantry Regiment, which had been moved to Rendova for rest and refit. Vice Admiral Halsey dispatched South Pacific Ground Forces Commander Lieutenant General Millard Harmon to evaluate the situation because of the incredibly slow American advance. Harmon sent an order on July 14th to Maja. Gen. Oscar W. Griswold, the U.S. Hester returned to command of the 43rd Infantry Division, and the Yifon 3rd Corps, which included both the 37th and 43rd Divisions, was to assume leadership of the NGOF in mid-July. Griswold had noted that the 169th and 172nd Regiments of the 43rd Division were a depleted force that could not capture Munda on their own. The remaining parts of the 37th and 43rd Divisions, however, were under Griswold's command by July 23rd. The latter was positioned on a 4,000-yard front on the left wing. In order to revive the halted operation, Griswold had previously suggested sending the U.S. 25th Infantry Division to New Georgia. Progress was accomplished on July 24-25, 1943, when the American force took the Ilangana Peninsula, southwest of Liana, and advanced toward the Lambetti Plantation on the southern coast of the Dragon Peninsula, supported by Marine M3 light tanks and Army soldiers. Both locations served as stepping stones to Munda Airfield, the ultimate goal. The 10th and 11th Defense Battalion's Marine M3 light tanks participated in this operation by assisting the Army forces that had halted on the forest trails en route to Munda. The Marine tanks spearheaded an attack on Bartley Ridge, which is located immediately northeast of the airfield, on July 26-27. However, some of the Marine armor was disabled or destroyed by suicidal Japanese infantry charges, and enemy 47mm anti-tank guns that were effectively disguised. Following the comparatively dismal performance of the 169th and 172nd Infantry Regiments, Hester was relieved of her command of the 43rd Division on July 29th by Major General John R. Hodge. The southern end of Munda Airstrip was seen as advance elements of the 43rd Division emerged from the jungle on August 1st. The airfield at Munda was taken 4 days later. In the Bibilo and Kokogolo Hills, many of the surviving Japanese defenders had taken to hiding in caves. Griswold informed Halsey on August 5th that organized opposition had stopped in the Munda region. He began sweeping up operations against the Japanese survivors with his 3,000 American forces. Within 10 days after its capture, Navy Seabees had to put in a lot of work to restore the severely damaged Munda Airfield so that Marine Vote F-4U Corsair planes could use it again. Major General J. Lawton Collins' 25th Infantry Division landed at Zanana Beach on July 21, 1943, and proceeded northwest. Collins' infantrymen were assigned to cut off the supply line and escape route for any Japanese who were still on New Georgia and weren't surrounded in the Munda area. The 25th's trek carried them through the swamp and jungle on the Munda Bairoko Trail. On August 9th, patrols of Colonel Liversedge's Joint Army and Marine Northern Landing Force were contacted by a battalion of Collins' 27th Infantry Regiment. The next day, Collins' division was given operational control over Liversedge's command. The remaining Marine Raider and 37th Division Army forces of Liversedge's Northern Landing Force, as well as the soldiers of the 25th Division, started to close in on Bairoko Harbor by the third week of August. The Americans lost Bairoko without a fight on August 24th, an objective that the Marine Raiders and troops from the 3rd Battalions of the 145th and 148th Regiments failed to capture during their July 2022 assault. The 1st Marine Raider Regiment left Bairoko and returned to Guadalcanal on August 29th. On the evening of August 23rd, over 3 weeks after Munda Airfield fell, General Sasaki expertly evacuated the rest of his Bairoko force across Kula Gulf to Kolombangara, ending the major ground fighting on New Georgia. After drawing a new line along the Kula Gulf coast of western New Georgia from Bairoko Harbor to Sunday Inlet, the latter location bordering Haythorne Sound, the waterway separating the Dragon Peninsula from neighboring Arundel Island, the Japanese commander had previously hoped that he could counterattack the Americans with sufficient reinforcements and supplies. But this plan was unrealistic due to the Tokyo Express being interdicted by the U.S. Navy. Many of the Japanese destroyer transports in the fleet were sunk when the Tokyo Express, loaded with reinforcements from the Shortland Islands, was intercepted on August 6th. Sasaki left the island for Kolombangara, across the Kula Gulf, since he could not get any more reinforcements for New Georgia. In order to allow Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura, the commander of the 8th Area Army, to strengthen the fortifications of the northern Solomon Islands, particularly Bougainville, Sasaki was instructed by a joint IJA-IJN directive of August 13th to remain in the New Georgia group for as long as possible. The relatively level and densely forested central Solomons of Arundel and Wana Wana, also known as Vona Vona, lay west of the Dragon Peninsula in New Georgia. Directly south of Kolombangara, with its Japanese airstrip at Vella, were these islands. After Munda Airport was lost, Sasaki had originally intended to utilize these islands as staging areas to retake portions of western New Georgia. Following the capture of the Munda Airstrip, elements of the American 37th Division were subjected to small arms and artillery fire from the Bougainville and Arundel Islands as they attempted to evacuate portions of western New Georgia. After 10 days of fighting, elements of the 43rd Infantry Division, which had been severely damaged in the war, landed on Banga Island on August 10th and took control of it. The few Japanese who survived managed to flee to Arundel and Kolombangara. Halsey gave Griswold the order to shell Vella Airfield on Kolombangara and take up position on Arundel Island on August 11th. The Hathorne Sound and Diamond Narrows canals divided Arundel from New Georgia's west coast. On August 27th, a single company of the Japanese 229th Regiment repelled the invasion of Arundel by shooting and infiltrating at night to cut off connection with the 172nd Infantry Regiment, 43rd Division. Subsequently, Sasaki's directives to prolong the delay of Halsey's forces intensified the enemy resistance. To bolster his forces on Arundel, Sasaki dispatched a battalion from his 13th Infantry Regiment, commanded by Major Kikuta from Kolombangara on September 8th. A series of enemy ambushes slowed the American assault, allowing Japanese artillery on Arundel to bombard the recently captured American airstrip at Munda Point. 2 weeks after arriving at Arundel, the 172nd Regiment stopped moving forward. Thus, sections of the 27th, 169th, and 103rd Infantry Regiments, as well as Marine tanks, had to be sent in to protect the island from fervent Japanese resistance. The Japanese on Arundel, however, were not resupplied because of ongoing U.S. Navy interdiction in Blackett Strait and Kula Gulf seas. Sasaki, remaining on Kolombangara, sent the rest of his 13th Infantry Regiment to Arundel on September 14th, with the hopeless idea to attack Munda in order to seize food, because he was without supplies from Bougainville and the Shortland Islands. On September 21st, the combat on Arundel came to an end, when Sasaki finally ordered his defenders to return to Kolombangara. On Arundel, Sasaki lost about 800 troops, but the Japanese managed to stall the American attack for over 3 weeks. As a result, the defenses of Rabaul and Bougainville were strengthened by General Imamura and Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka, commander of the 11th Air Fleet in Rabaul and commander of all Solomon's naval units. About 300 American men lost their lives on Arundel. Halsey's original plan intended for the capture of Vella Airport on Kolombangara to come after the attack on Munda. The Japanese garrison on Kolombangara was estimated to have a sizable force of little less than 1,000 soldiers. Halsey chose not to strike Kolombangara as a preliminary to entering the Northern Solomons because he did not want to launch another drawn-out war to seize Vella. Rather, the Americans avoided the fiercely fortified Kolombangara and used naval and air interdiction to stop its resupply. Only 15 miles northwest of Kolombangara, the thinly defended island of Vella Lavella was taken by the South Pacific Force. The Japanese garrison there was estimated by U.S. Navy intelligence to number about 1,000 soldiers. In addition to providing a forward airfield at Bairoko that could help cut off enemy supply routes to Kolombangara, Halsey's staff reasoned that Vella Lavella, the northernmost island in the New Georgia group, would also serve as a base for American air support for operations in the Northern Solomon Islands in the future. A northern landing and occupation force of more than 6,500 soldiers, including the Army's 25th Cavalry Reconnaissance Unit, the 58th Naval Construction Battalion, the 35th RCT of the 25th Division, and the 4th Marine Defense Battalion landed almost unopposed at Bairoko on the southeast coast of the island on August 15, 1943. The Japanese understood that they would want a nearby base in order to recover the troops and equipment on Kolombangara, and the northern tip of Vella Lavella seemed like a sensible location. Armed barges had landed 2 companies of the 13th Infantry Regiment and several SNLF troops at Honaniu on the night of August 17th at 18 in order to make it easier to construct a camp there. Halsey observed that the Japanese mop-up on Vella Lavella was not proceeding as planned. In order to finish forcing the German garrison into the northwest corner of the island with a 2-pronged onslaught that started on September 24th, he brought in reinforcements, the 14th New Zealand Brigade of the 3rd New Zealand Division, which arrived on September 18, 1943. Due to the small size and ongoing withdrawal of Japanese soldiers, there was never any significant ground battle on Vella Lavella. But in order to delay Halsey's mission and get more time to fortify the Northern Solomon Islands, the Japanese harried the Kiwis as they advanced through the Vella Lavella jungles. The Japanese used persistent delaying tactics during the intermittent battle on Vella Lavella, which continued until October 5-6. Naval surface combat and constant aircraft strikes on American vessels, including almost 100,000 enemy sorties between August 15th and September 3rd, constituted the true battle for Vella Lavella. To repair the airfield at Bairoko, Halsey dispatched the Navy's Seabees to Vella Lavella. American planes equipped with auxiliary fuel tanks were to be positioned there in preparation for a round-trip air attack on Rabaul. In preparation for upcoming assaults in the Northern Solomons, including the Marine parachutist raid on Choiseul in late October 1943, the American admiral also set up a marine staging facility on Vella Lavella. In order to achieve this, in mid-September, forces from the 3rd Marine Division were landed at Ruravai, farther up the eastern coast of Vella Lavella, by elements of the Viceberg Marine Amphibious Corps, IMAC. General Sasaki relocated his men from Gizo Island to Kolombangara, which would eventually have nearly 1,000 IJA and IJN troops, on September 20th, 21 when he withdrew his Arundel forces. The preparations for the withdrawal of the Kolombangara garrison started 2 days later. Sasaki was in charge of ensuring the safe evacuation of these soldiers from the northern bays and coastline areas of Kolombangara. Japanese destroyers that received landing barges from Kolombangara carrying troops were able to do this. On a moonless night on September 28th, the evacuation began, transporting those troops to Choiseul, a 6-hour journey north over the Slot. Despite U.S. efforts, the Kolombangara pullout was finalized by the end of the first week of October. Navy surface ships will interfere with the evacuations. The fleeing Japanese forces from Vella Lavella were transferred to the Shortland Islands off the southern coast of Bougainville, while the Kolombangara troops that were not diverted to Choiseul were sent to either Bougainville or Rabaul. During the battle on and the deft evacuations from the islands of the New Georgia group in the Central Solomons, General Sasaki had been able to keep his forces intact. From November 1, 1943, until the conclusion of the Pacific War, these Japanese forces will shortly engage in combat with Halsey's northern thrust once more on the sizable northern Solomon island of Bougainville. Despite being overshadowed by the earlier 6-month assault on Guadalcanal, the American campaign for New Georgia and adjacent islands in the Central Solomon Group, which lasted from early July 1943 until the end of September, was one of the bloodiest battles in the South Pacific. The seizure of Munda Airport marked the end of Halsey's exhausting assault on New Georgia, which became the cornerstone of Japanese defense in the Central Solomons. Nevertheless, this Marine and Army triumph did not receive the same level of media attention as Nimitz's Central Pacific or MacArthur's New Guinea battles. Instead, in a harsh environment and hostile terrain, including heavily fortified defensive positions, frequently protected from aerial attack by the dense jungle canopy, elite Marine Corps infantrymen, gunners, and tankers, as well as former National Guardsmen from New York, New Jersey, Ohio, and Washington, D.C., faced the previously victorious Japanese troops. The success on New Georgia and the neighboring islands broadened the success template required to develop the island hopping technique in Solomon Islands and other Pacific theater locations.